The listing was posted on a contract staffing board I'd been checking every morning for 3 weeks. I was between jobs and running out of the kind of patience that keeps you from applying to things you don't fully understand. The posting was brief. It read, "Monitoring position, overnight shift, single room observation. No prior experience required. Must be comfortable with extended periods of low activity. Must be detail-oriented. Compensation above market rate." There was no company name. The reply address was a generic domain, something like staffing-contacts with a string of numbers. I sent my resume. I didn't expect to hear back. They called the same afternoon. A woman's voice, professional, unhurried. She asked whether I had any issues with overnight work. I said no. She asked whether I had any medical conditions that affected my alertness during long periods of sitting. I said no. She asked if I was comfortable being alone for the duration of a shift. I said yes. She said the position involved monitoring a specific room via a closed-circuit camera system and maintaining a written log. She said the room was to remain empty at all times and that my role was to confirm this. I asked what the room was used for. She said it wasn't currently in use. I asked what I should do if someone entered it. She paused, then said that was unlikely, and that if I observed anything unexpected, I should note it in the log and contact the supervisor number provided. She gave me a start date, an address, and a 4-digit access code. She said someone would meet me on the first night to walk me through the setup. I wrote everything down on the back of an electricity bill. The building was in an industrial area east of the city, one of those zones where the architecture doesn't commit to anything. Half-renovated warehouses next to small offices next to fenced lots with no signage. The building itself was 3 stories, brick and concrete, with a flat roof and narrow windows on the upper floors. There was a single entrance on the south side, a heavy steel door with a card reader and a numeric keypad. I arrived at 10:45 on a Tuesday night in March. It was cold. The parking lot had 4 spaces and 1 other car, a dark sedan with no plates visible from where I stood. I entered the code. The door buzzed and I pushed through into a hallway lit with overhead fluorescents that gave everything a bluish cast. A man was waiting for me just inside. He was maybe 50, thin, wearing a gray jacket and carrying a clipboard. He didn't introduce himself by name. He shook my hand and said he'd show me the setup. We walked down the hallway, which was long and featureless, passing several closed doors with no labels. At the end, we turned left and entered a small room, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a desk, a chair, a monitor, a telephone with no label on the buttons, and a black binder. The monitor showed a single feed, a grayscale image of a room. He pointed at the screen and said, "That's the room." He opened the binder and showed me the log sheets. Each sheet had columns for the date, time of observation, a checkmark field labeled status, empty, and a notes column. He said I was to check the feed every 15 minutes and mark the log accordingly. He said the shift ran from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. He said the telephone connected to a supervisor line that was staffed at all times, but that I should only use it if something required immediate clarification. He said the room I was monitoring was on the 2nd floor of the same building, directly above us, and 1 corridor to the east. He said I was not to enter the room. He said this once, clearly, without emphasis, the way someone might say that a door locks automatically. Then he wished me a good shift and left. I heard the outer door close behind him a minute later. Then I heard the sedan start and pull away. I sat down. The chair was an office chair, old but functional, with a fabric seat and plastic armrests. The desk had nothing on it besides the monitor, the phone, the binder, and a pen. The pen was black, medium point, unremarkable. I opened the binder. There were about 30 blank log sheets and, behind them, a single laminated page with instructions. The instructions were as follows. 1. Observe the monitoring feed at intervals of no more than 15 minutes. 2. Record each observation in the log with the correct time and date. 3. Confirm that the room is empty. 4. If the room does not appear empty, do not enter the room. Contact the supervisor line immediately. 5. Do not leave the monitoring station during your shift except to use the restroom, which was the first door on the right back down the hallway. 6. Do not adjust the camera. 7. The camera is fixed and does not require calibration or maintenance. 8. At the end of the shift, leave the binder on the desk and exit through the main entrance. That was it. I looked at the monitor. The room was empty. It was a plain room, viewed from what appeared to be an upper corner, probably a camera mounted near the ceiling on the far wall. The image was grayscale, as I mentioned, with decent resolution. I could see a concrete floor, 4 walls, no windows. The ceiling had a single fixture, a fluorescent tube that was on, casting an even, flat light across the space. The room was maybe 15 by 15 feet. There was nothing in it. No furniture, no equipment, no markings on the floor. The walls were smooth and light-colored, probably painted white or off-white, though in grayscale, everything read as a uniform gray. The door was on the left wall, a standard interior door, closed. There was no vent visible, though I assumed there had to be one somewhere. The floor was bare. The room was, by every measure I could apply, empty. I wrote the date, the time, 11:07, checked the box for status empty, and left the notes column blank. I checked again at 11:20, empty, 11:35, empty, 11:50, empty, midnight, empty. I settled into the rhythm of it. Every 15 minutes I looked at the screen, confirmed what I already knew, marked the log. Between checks I sat. I didn't bring a book. I hadn't been told whether I could, and I hadn't thought to ask. The room I was sitting in had no decoration, no clock on the wall, no window. I used my phone to check the time between observations. The fluorescent light above me buzzed faintly, a constant, low-frequency hum that I stopped noticing after the first hour and then started noticing again after the second. At 12:45, I logged my observation and then, out of nothing more than restlessness, looked more closely at the feed. I studied the edges of the frame. The camera's field of view covered most of the room, but not all of it. There was a thin margin on the right side, maybe 1.5 feet of floor space and wall that fell just outside the lens. This wasn't unusual. No single camera covers every angle. But I found myself wondering what that margin contained. Probably nothing. The rest of the room was empty, and there was no reason to think the sliver I couldn't see was any different. Still, I noted it. Not in the log. Just in my mind. I thought about it the way you think about the blind spot in your rearview mirror. You know it's there, and you know it probably doesn't matter, but you're aware of it. The next few hours passed without incident. I made my checks. The room stayed empty. At 3:15, I used the restroom. It was small, clean, institutional. A toilet, a sink, a mirror, paper towels, no window. I washed my hands and returned to the monitoring station. The screen showed the empty room, as expected. I logged the 3:30 check. Empty. 3:45. Empty. At 4:02, something changed. I was looking at the screen, not for a scheduled check, but just because my eyes had drifted there, and I noticed that the light in the room looked different. Not dramatically. The fluorescent fixture was still on, but the quality of the illumination seemed uneven in a way it hadn't been before. There was a faint gradient near the center of the floor, a section where the light appeared slightly dimmer, as though something were diffusing it. Not a shadow, exactly. A shadow would imply an object between the light source and the surface. This was more like a soft reduction in brightness, roughly oval, maybe 2 feet across, near the middle of the room. I stared at it. It didn't move. It didn't change. It was subtle enough that I questioned whether it had been there all along, and I simply hadn't noticed. I pulled the binder toward me and looked at my earlier log entries. I had written nothing in the notes column for any of them. I hadn't been paying that kind of attention. I looked back at the screen. The area of reduced brightness was still there, or I thought it was. The more I looked, the less certain I became. Grayscale images on low-resolution monitors are not ideal for detecting subtle changes in illumination. The human eye finds patterns. I decided I was probably wrong. I logged the 4:15 check. Status: empty. In the notes column, I wrote, possible variation in lighting near center of floor, likely monitor artifact. I moved on. At 4:30, the area was gone, or it had never been there. The floor looked uniformly lit. I felt a small, clean relief and logged the check without notes. At 5:15, I noticed the door. The door to the room, the one on the left wall, had been closed in every frame I'd observed since the start of the shift. It was still closed, but it looked different. It took me a moment to identify what had changed. The gap at the bottom of the door, the thin line of space between the door and the floor, appeared wider than before. Not by much, maybe a 1/4 inch, maybe less. I was aware that this could be a distortion of perception caused by staring at a fixed image for 6 hours. I was aware that I had no baseline measurement. I had not, at the start of my shift, noted the exact width of the gap beneath the door. No one would. But I had spent enough hours looking at this image that the proportions had become familiar, almost intimate, and something about the door's lower edge felt wrong. I leaned closer to the monitor. The gap was dark, as you'd expect, a thin strip of black where the door didn't quite meet the floor. It told me nothing. I logged the 5:15 check. Status: empty. Notes: door gap may appear slightly wider. Unable to confirm. No other changes. The rest of the shift was uneventful. At 7, I closed the binder, left it on the desk as instructed, and walked out. The morning was overcast and cold. I drove home, slept until 2 in the afternoon, and ate something forgettable. I thought about the room a few times, the way you think about a strange sentence you read somewhere and can't quite parse. Then I stopped thinking about it and watched television until it was time to go back. The second night was quiet. The room was empty at every check. The lighting was even. The door gap looked normal, though I realized I still didn't know what normal was. I had started paying attention too late to establish a reliable baseline. This bothered me in a minor professional way. I decided that from the 3rd shift onward, I would make a more careful note of the room's condition at the start of each night, so that any subsequent changes would be measurable against something definite. On the 3rd night, I arrived at 10:50 and sat down at 11. I spent the first 10 minutes studying the feed carefully. I noted the position of the light fixture, centered on the ceiling, oriented lengthwise east to west. I noted the texture of the floor, smooth concrete with no visible cracks or seams. I noted the walls, uniform, no marks, no scuffs, no discoloration. I noted the door, closed, standard interior door, no visible handle on this side, though the angle might have hidden it. I noted the gap beneath the door, dark, approximately a 1/4 inch, consistent along its width. I noted the camera's blind spot on the right side, the thin margin of unseen floor and wall. I wrote all of this in the notes column of my first entry. It filled the space and continued on to the next line. I felt better. I had a reference now. At 12:30, I performed a routine check and noticed something I hadn't seen before. Along the base of the far wall, directly below the camera, and therefore at the very bottom of the frame, there was a faint line. Not a crack, not a shadow. A line, thin and straight, running horizontally for perhaps 3 feet before it left the visible frame on the right side. The 16th night introduced a new anomaly. At 11:45, during a routine check, I noticed that the monitor displayed a faint artifact in the upper right corner of the image, not in the room itself. On the screen, a small cluster of pixels, maybe 8 by 8, that appeared to be a slightly different shade of gray than the surrounding image. It was static. It didn't flicker. It was just there, a tiny square of wrong shade in the corner of the frame. I noted it and moved on. At 12:15, the artifact was gone. At 12:45, it was back, in a different position, now in the lower left of the frame. Same size, same quality, a patch that didn't match. At 1 o'clock, it had moved again, to the center top of the frame. I logged each position. I drew a small diagram in my notebook, showing the artifact's migration across the screen. It moved in no discernible pattern. By 3 o'clock, it had appeared in 6 different locations. By 4, it was gone entirely. I called the supervisor line. I described the artifact. The man on the line said it sounded like a pixel anomaly and was within normal parameters for the equipment's age. I asked how old the equipment was. He said he didn't have that information. I asked whether the artifact had been reported before. He said he could check and would note my observation. He asked whether the room was empty. I said yes. He said, "Thank you," and the call ended. On the 17th night, I found a second binder. It was in the desk drawer, which I had opened looking for a spare pen. The drawer contained the spare pen, a small flashlight, and a binder identical to the one on the desk. I opened it. Inside were log sheets, filled out in a handwriting that was not mine. The entries were dated from approximately 6 weeks before my start date. The handwriting was small and precise. The status column was checked empty on every entry. The notes column was mostly blank. But starting about 2 weeks into the logs, notes began to appear. I read them in order. 12:45. Faint mark on floor near center. Gone by 1:15. 2:10. Light appears uneven. Possible fixture issue. 3:30. Gap beneath door looks different. Wider maybe. 01:50. Brief sound from direction of room. Low frequency, not repeated. 2:20. Proportions of room seem off. Can't identify specific change. 03:05. Pixel artifact on monitor, upper left. Moved to lower right by 03:30. I read through the entire binder. The progression was almost identical to mine. The previous monitor had noticed the same anomalies in roughly the same sequence. Light changes, transient marks, the door gap, sounds, the pixel artifact, the sense of altered proportions, and then, in the final week of entries, the notes changed. Oh, 2:15. I'm not sure I'm seeing the room. Oh, 1:40. Something is different, but the image is the same. Oh, 3:05. Checked status as empty per guidelines. Oh, 4:20. Checked status as empty. I don't know if it is. The last entry in the binder was dated on a Tuesday. The notes column read, "The room is not empty. I've marked it as empty. I don't know what else to do." The status box was checked empty. There were no entries after that date. My employment had begun the following Tuesday. I sat with the binder open in my lap for a long time. I became aware of the monitor in my peripheral vision. The room, on screen, was empty. I did not look at it directly. I was thinking about the previous monitor. about the fact that they had experienced exactly what I was experiencing, had followed the same perceptual path, had arrived at the same uncertainty, and had apparently left or been replaced. I was thinking about the instruction. If you are uncertain whether the room is empty, mark the status as empty. I was thinking about what kind of system requires an observer to confirm something they're not sure is true. I put the second binder back in the drawer. I continued my shift. I checked the room every 15 minutes. It was empty. I marked it as empty. At 7, I went home. I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about the phrasing. Mark the status as empty. Not confirm that it is empty. Not verify. Mark. As if the act of marking was the point. As if the log was not a record of the room's state, but an input. Something the system needed to receive. I thought about observation in physics, how in certain models the act of measurement affects the system being measured. I had studied this only casually, in the way most people encounter quantum mechanics, through analogies and pop science summaries. But the principle lodged in my mind. What if the room's status wasn't being recorded? What if it was being determined? What if my checkmarks were not observations but instructions? This was not a rational thought. I recognized it as the kind of thinking that emerges from sleep deprivation and too many hours in a featureless room staring at a featureless image. I told myself to eat a proper meal, get real rest, and approach the next shift with professional detachment. I did these things. It didn't help. On the 18th night, I arrived early. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 10 minutes before going in. The building looked the same. The lot was empty, except for my car. No sedan this time. I entered the code and went to the station. The monitor was on, as it always was. The room was empty, as it always was. I began my shift. At midnight, I broke protocol. I left the monitoring station and walked to the stairwell door. I opened it and listened. Silence. Cool air. That faint paper and concrete smell. I stepped through the door and stood on the first step. The stairs went up to a landing, turned, and continued to the second floor. The light on the landing was a bare bulb, low wattage, casting a yellowish glow. I listened for 30 seconds. Nothing. I climbed to the landing. The stairs continued up to a door at the top, identical to the one at the bottom. Gray fire door, wired glass window. Through the glass, I could see a hallway, lit with the same bluish fluorescence as the ground floor. I couldn't see much. The hallway extended in both directions. I tried the handle. It was locked. I stood there. I tried the handle again, slowly, carefully, as though a different speed might produce a different result. The door was locked. I went back to the station. On the monitor, the room was empty. I logged my 12:15 check. Status, empty. But there was something in the notes column of the 12 o'clock entry. I had not written a 12 o'clock entry. I had been in the stairwell at midnight. The 12 o'clock line was filled out in my handwriting. Status, empty. Notes, blank. Time, 00. My handwriting. I had not written it. I had been on the stairs at midnight. I was certain of this. But the entry existed in ink in my hand. I sat very still. I looked at the entry again. It was real. The ink was real. The handwriting was mine, the way I form my zeros, the way my check marks slant slightly to the left. I touched the page. The ink was dry, which told me nothing, since all the ink on the page was dry. But this entry had been made during a period when I was not at the desk, when I was not in the room, when I was not holding the pen. I considered calling the supervisor line. I considered what I would say. Someone is filling out the log in my handwriting. I considered how that would sound. I did not call. I continued the shift. I made my checks. The room was empty. At 3:08 that night, I heard the sound again. Low, Vibrational. From above. This time it lasted longer, maybe 5 seconds. And during those 5 seconds, the image on the monitor changed. Not the room. The image. The quality of the picture shifted in a way I struggle to describe. The resolution didn't change. The frame didn't move. But the image seemed to gain depth, as though the flat grayscale feed had briefly acquired a third dimension. The floor of the room appeared to recede. The walls seemed to converge toward a vanishing point that hadn't been there before. The room, for 5 seconds, looked like a space you could fall into. Then the sound stopped and the image flattened back to normal. I logged this. My hand was steady. My notes were precise. 0308. Audible vibration, 5 seconds. Concurrent visual distortion on feed. Apparent increase in depth of field. Image returned to baseline at 0308 and approximately 12 seconds. I did not log my emotional state. If I had, it would have read, "I am beginning to understand why the previous monitor left." The 19th night was unremarkable. The 20th was unremarkable. The room was empty. The log was clean. My notebook had minimal entries. I followed the 45-second rule. I did not visit the stairwell. I did not search the desk for additional materials. I performed the job as described. On both nights, I felt a strong, clear sense that I was being watched, which I attributed to the enclosed environment and the psychological effects of prolonged surveillance work. You spend enough time watching a room, and part of your brain starts to assume the room is watching back. This is not mystical. It's a well-documented cognitive phenomenon. I noted it and moved on. On the 21st night, the room was different. I arrived, sat down, and looked at the monitor. The room was empty, but it was not the same room. The dimensions were wrong. The room I had been watching for 3 weeks was approximately 15 by 15 feet, a square. The room on the monitor was rectangular, noticeably longer than it was wide. The proportions were roughly 15 by 20, maybe 22. The door was on the left wall, as before. The light fixture was on the ceiling, as before. The floor was concrete. The walls were uniform. But the shape of the room had changed. I checked my baseline notes from the 3rd night. I had described the room as approximately 15 by 15 feet, roughly square. The room on the screen was not square. I looked at the door. It was the same door, or it appeared to be. I looked at the floor. Same concrete, same absence of features. But the back wall, the wall facing the camera, was farther away than it should have been. I called the supervisor line. The man answered as usual. I said, "The room on the monitor appears to have changed dimensions." He was quiet. Then he said, "Is the room empty?" I said, "Yes, but the proportions are different from my previous observations. The room appears to be rectangular rather than square. The far wall is farther away." He said, "Is the room empty?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Log your observation." I said, "I'm telling you the room has changed shape." He said, "The room is the room you're monitoring. If it's empty, log it as empty." I said, "But it's not the same room." He said, "It's the room on your monitor. That's the room you're monitoring." Then he said something I didn't expect. He said, "The room doesn't have to be the same. It has to be empty." I didn't respond for a moment. He asked if there was anything else. I said no. He hung up. I logged the check. Status: empty. Notes: room dimensions appear changed, rectangular, approximately 15 by 20 feet, far wall farther than baseline. Supervisor contacted, directed to log as empty if empty. I stared at the note I'd just written. I read the supervisor's words back to myself. The room doesn't have to be the same. It has to be empty. This made sense only if the identity of the room was not the point. If the thing I was monitoring was not a specific physical space, but a status, a condition, the room could change. The room could be anything. As long as it was empty, it was the room. The room was not a room. The room was whatever was on the screen, defined not by its walls, but by its emptiness. I felt something shift in my understanding, the way a key turns. Not a revelation, more like a subsidence, a settling of ground that I had thought was solid. The 22nd night, the room was square again, 15 by 15, as though it had never changed. I logged this with a note about the dimensions matching my original baseline. The 23rd night, same thing. Square, empty, consistent. The 24th night, I noticed that the door was on the right wall instead of the left. I checked my notes. Every observation from night 1 through night 23 placed the door on the left wall. Now it was on the right. The camera angle appeared unchanged. The room was the same dimensions, roughly square, but the door had moved, or the room had mirrored, or the camera was showing me a different room, or I was wrong about where the door had been. But I wasn't wrong. I had weeks of notes. I had the baseline from night 3. The door was on the left. Now it was on the right. I did not call the supervisor. I logged the check. Status: empty. Notes: door position has changed from left wall to right wall. Previous observations consistently placed door on left. No explanation. On the 25th night, the door was on the left again. I felt nothing about this. Not relief, not confusion, not fear. I noted it the way I would note a change in temperature. The room did what it did. My job was to say it was empty. I began to wonder about the camera. The instructions said it was fixed and did not require maintenance. The supplementary guidelines said not to adjust the monitor. But what was the camera actually showing me? If the room could change shape, if the door could move, if the dimensions were not stable, then the camera was not recording a fixed physical space. It was recording something that behaved like a room, but did not have the properties of one. Or it was recording a real room that did not have the properties I assumed rooms had. Or the camera itself was variable, showing me different things at different times for reasons I was not equipped to understand. I started measuring the image, not the room, the image itself. I used a small plastic ruler against the monitor screen. I measured the height of the door in pixels estimated by ruler distance. I measured the width of the visible floor. I measured the apparent distance from the camera to the far wall based on the converging lines of the floor and walls. I recorded these measurements in my notebook. On any given night, the measurements were internally consistent. The image made spatial sense. Perspective lines converged properly. Proportions were realistic. It looked like a real room filmed by a real camera. But night to night, the measurements changed. Not always, not dramatically, but they changed. The room breathed. It settled and expanded. It was not the same room twice. On the 28th night, I stopped checking every 15 minutes. I checked every 5. I don't know exactly when this started. I became aware of it around 1 in the morning, when I realized I had 17 log entries for the first 2 hours of the shift instead of the expected 8. I had been checking compulsively, drawn back to the screen by something I couldn't name. Not curiosity, not anxiety. Something more like obligation, as though the room needed to be seen more frequently, and I was responding to that need without deciding to. I forced myself back to the 15-minute schedule. This was harder than it should have been. Between checks, I sat with my hands in my lap and looked at the wall of the monitoring station. The wall was blank. The room was above me and to the east. The room was on the screen. The screen was in front of me. I did not look at it. I counted seconds. When 15 minutes had passed, I looked. The room was empty. I looked away. At 2:45, I looked at the screen and the room was dark. The fluorescent fixture was off. The image was black. Not the gray black of a dimly lit space, but full black, the kind of black that means the camera is receiving no light. I could see nothing. The room was, as far as I could tell, completely dark. I had never seen this before. The light had always been on. In 3.5 weeks of monitoring, the light had been on continuously. I waited. I counted to 45. The room stayed dark. I logged the check. Status. I left the status box blank. Notes. Room is dark. No visible content. Unable to confirm status. I called the supervisor line. It rang. It rang again. It rang 7 times. No one answered. I hung up and called again. 7 rings. No answer. I hung up. I looked at the screen. Black. At 2:52, the light came back on. The room was empty. It was square. The door was on the left wall. Everything was as it had been. I stared at the screen. 45 seconds passed. I kept staring. A minute. 2 minutes. The room was empty and normal and exactly as it should have been, except that 7 minutes ago, it had been completely dark and no one had answered the phone. I went back to the 2:45 entry and filled in the status box. Empty. I checked it with a mark that matched all my other marks. Then I stared at what I had done. I had marked the room as empty when I couldn't see it. I had marked it as empty after the fact, retroactively, based not on observation, but on the assumption that it must have been empty because it was empty before and after. I had done exactly what the guidelines told me to do. I had defaulted to empty. I had produced the entry the log required. I felt sick. Not physically. Something else. A kind of vertigo that had nothing to do with height or motion. A sense that the ground rules of what I was doing had shifted, and I had shifted with them and hadn't noticed until now. On the 29th night, I brought a small digital camera with me, not to photograph the monitor, to photograph the log. I wanted an external record of my entries, something I could review later to confirm that what I had written was what I had written. I took a photo of each page at the start of the shift and again at the end. This made me feel marginally more in control. At 1:15, I checked the feed and saw something I had not seen before. There was a mark on the far wall. Not a transient line like the ones I'd observed previously. A mark. It was small, dark, roughly circular, about the size of a coin, located approximately 5 feet from the floor and centered on the wall. I stared at it. It didn't move. It didn't change. It was just there. A small dark circle on the wall of an otherwise empty room. Was the room empty? There was nothing in it. No furniture, no objects, no people. But there was a mark on the wall that hadn't been there before. Did a mark constitute a presence? The guidelines said to report objects or presences. Was a mark an object? Was it a presence? It was something that had not been there, and now was. It occupied space, however minimally. It changed the visual field. It was new information in a system that was supposed to contain none. I logged it. Status: empty. Notes: dark circular mark on far wall, approximately 5 feet from floor, centered. Approximately 1 inch diameter. Not previously observed. Room otherwise empty. I checked at 1:30. The mark was still there. 1:45. Still there. 2 o'clock. Still there. Each time, I logged the room as empty. Each time, the mark persisted. At 2:15, I stopped logging the mark in the notes. It had become a feature of the room. If the room was the room on my screen, and the mark was on the wall, then the room was a room with a mark on the wall, and the room was empty. Both things were true, unless the mark was not part of the room, unless the mark was what I was supposed to be watching for, unless the mark was what not empty looked like, and I was labeling it empty because the guidelines told me to. At 3 o'clock, the mark was gone. The wall was clean. I felt a complicated relief. On the 30th night, I opened the desk drawer to check the second binder. It was not there. The drawer contained the spare pen, the flashlight, and nothing else. I searched the drawer thoroughly. I checked behind the binder on the desk, under the desk, around the desk. The second binder was gone. I had not removed it. I had not seen anyone else in the building. The drawer had contained it on the 17th night. Now, it didn't. I considered calling the supervisor line to ask about it. I decided against it. I already knew what he would say. "Is the room empty?" I began to pay closer attention to the monitoring station itself. This was the space I actually occupied, the room I was physically in, and I had been so focused on the screen that I had barely examined it. The walls were the same blank surfaces they'd always been. The desk was the same desk, the chair, the phone, the binder, the pen. But I measured the room. I used my plastic ruler and my own stride, which I knew to be approximately 30 inches. The room was 10 feet by 12 feet, as I had estimated on the first night. I noted this. The next night, I measured again. 10 by 12. The next night, 10 by 12. The next night, 10 by 11. I measured 3 times, 10 by 11. The room was a foot shorter than it had been. The wall behind me, the wall opposite the monitor, was a foot closer. I stood with my back against it and looked at the desk. Everything else appeared the same. The desk was in the same position. The distance from the desk to the wall behind me had decreased. I could feel the wall against my shoulders. The room was smaller. I did not log this because the log was for the monitored room, not the monitoring station. I wrote it in my notebook. Station dimensions changed, 10 by 11, previously 10 by 12, back wall approximately 1 foot closer. I added, I don't know what to do with this information. The next night, the station was 10 by 12 again. I measured twice to be sure. I sat in the chair and tried to feel the difference. I couldn't. A foot is not much, but it's enough to notice when you're looking for it. When you're not looking for it, it's nothing. On the 33rd night, the feed showed 2 doors. The room was empty. The light was on. The floor was bare. The proportions were normal, 15 by 15, square. But there were 2 doors, one on the left wall where I expected it, one on the right wall in the mirrored position. Both were closed. Both were identical. I stared at them for exactly 45 seconds, then looked away. I logged the check. Status: empty. Notes: 2 doors visible. Left wall and right wall, both closed. Room otherwise unchanged. I did not call the supervisor. I did not feel alarmed. I felt something worse than alarm. I felt like I understood, not what was happening, but the shape of what was happening. The way you can understand the shape of a hole without knowing what made it. The room was testing the boundaries of empty, or I was, or the system was. 2 doors meant 2 exits, or 2 entrances, or 2 possibilities, and the room was still empty because doors are architecture, not presence. The room was empty the way a sentence is empty before someone reads it. It has structure. It has components, but it contains nothing until it is observed. At 1:45, I checked again. 1 door, left wall, normal. At 2 o'clock, I checked. 1 door, right wall. At 2:15, 1 door, left wall. At 2:30, no door. The room had no door. 4 walls, a ceiling, a floor, a light fixture. No door. I looked at this for 45 seconds. An enclosed room with no entrance. A sealed box. The most empty a room can be, because nothing can get in. I logged it. Status: empty. Notes: no door visible. Room fully enclosed. At 2:45, the door was back. Left wall. I did not note this. Somewhere around the 35th or 36th night, I lost the ability to distinguish between what I observed and what I recorded. These had always been the same thing, or I had assumed they were. I observed the room. I recorded the observation. The record was a representation of the observation, which was a representation of the room. 3 layers: reality, perception, documentation. But the layers were collapsing. When I looked at the log, I could not always remember the observation that had produced the entry. When I observed the room, I was already composing the log entry in my mind, already shaping what I saw into the format the log required. The act of writing status empty had begun to feel like the act of making the room empty, as though my checkmark was not a confirmation, but an instruction. I tried to resist this. I tried to observe first, purely, without the log in mind, and then record afterward. But the format was too ingrained. 15 minutes. Look. Status. Notes. The rhythm of it had become the rhythm of my perception. I saw the room in 15-minute intervals because that was how I was required to see it. Between checks, the room did not exist for me. It was on the screen, presumably, but I was not looking. It existed only in the moments I observed it, and immediately ceased existing when I looked away. The log was the only continuous record, and the log said empty at every line, so the room was empty. The room was empty because I said so. I said so because the room was empty. The circularity was perfect and airtight, and I was inside it. On the 37th night, at 3:22 in the morning, I looked at the monitor and saw myself. Not a reflection, not a figure that resembled me. I saw myself sitting in a chair in the room. The monitored room. The empty room. The camera showed the room from its usual angle, the upper corner of the far wall. The room was 15 by 15, square, with the door on the left wall. The light was on, and in the center of the room there was a chair, and in the chair there was a person, and the person was me. I was sitting in the same posture I was sitting in at the monitoring station, leaned slightly forward, hands on the desk. Except there was no desk in the room. My hands were on my thighs. I was looking up toward the camera. I was looking at myself, looking at myself. I did not move. The figure on the screen did not move. We sat in perfect synchrony, separated by a floor and a hallway and a stairwell and a locked door, or separated by nothing at all, connected by a cable that ran from a camera to a monitor and carried an image that should have been empty. 45 seconds passed. I looked away. I looked at the log. My hands were shaking very slightly, a fine tremor that I could feel more than see. I picked up the pen. I wrote the time. 3:22. I looked at the status box, the small square that I'd been filling with checkmarks for 37 nights. I checked it. Empty. I wrote empty. In the notes column, I wrote nothing. I looked back at the screen. The room was empty. No chair, no figure, no me. Just the room. Concrete floor, white walls, fluorescent light, closed door on the left wall. Empty. I sat for a long time without checking the log, without reaching for the pen. I sat, and I looked at the room, and I let more than 45 seconds pass. I let minutes pass. I watched the empty room with the full weight of my attention, everything I had, all the focus that 37 nights of observation had refined into something almost physical, and I waited for it to show me something, anything. The room was empty. It stayed empty. It was aggressively, assertively, undeniably empty, and I understood, with a certainty that felt like nausea, that this was because I was watching. The room was empty because I was observing it. The room behaved when looked at. It performed its emptiness for me, the way a stage is empty before the curtain rises, not because nothing is there, but because everything that is there is waiting. I broke. Not dramatically. I didn't scream or run. I put the pen down. I closed the binder. I stood up. I walked out of the monitoring station, down the hallway, past the restroom, to the stairwell door. I opened it. I climbed the stairs. I reached the second-floor door. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. The hallway on the second floor was identical to the one below. Same fluorescence, same bluish cast, same featureless walls. I walked east, counting doors. First door on the left, second door on the left, third door on the left. I stopped. I didn't know which door led to the room. I hadn't been given a room number. I hadn't been shown a floor plan. I stood in the hallway and looked at the doors, and they were all the same. Unmarked, closed, identical. I tried the first door. It opened into a small empty room, maybe 8 by 8. Not the room, wrong dimensions. I closed it. I tried the second door, a closet, narrow and deep with bare shelves. I closed it. I tried the third door. It was locked. I tried the fourth, locked. The fifth, locked. I walked further down the hallway. More doors, all locked. I tried every door on both sides of the hallway. 3 rooms and a closet were open. None of them was the room. The room I was monitoring, the 15 by 15 square with the concrete floor and the fluorescent light, and the door that moved and the walls that breathed, was behind one of the locked doors. Or it was behind none of them. Or it was not on this floor at all, despite what I'd been told. I went back to the station. I sat down. I opened the binder. I looked at the monitor. The room was empty. On the log, the entries from my absence were filled in. Every 15 minutes in my handwriting marked empty. No notes. The log had continued without me. The observation had continued without an observer. Or the observer had continued without me. I did not react to this. I think I had passed the point where new impossibilities registered as surprises. The log was the log. It said what it said. I picked up the pen and resumed my entries. At 4 o'clock, empty. 4:15, empty. 4:30, empty. At 5 o'clock, I looked at the screen and the room was not there. The monitor showed the monitoring station. My room. The room I was sitting in, viewed from above, from the same upper corner angle. I could see myself at the desk. I could see the binder, the phone, the pen in my hand. I could see the monitor, and on the monitor I could see a tiny image that, if I could have magnified it, would have shown the monitoring station, and in the monitoring station, me, and on my monitor, the monitoring station, and so on. An infinite regression of observation, each layer containing the one above it, each room empty except for the person watching. I looked at this for longer than 45 seconds. I looked at it until the shift ended. The image did not change. The room on the screen was the room I was in, and the room I was in was being monitored, and I was both the observer and the observed, and the log in front of me said, empty, in a handwriting I recognized as my own, but could no longer trust. At 7 o'clock, I closed the binder. I left it on the desk. I walked out of the building. The morning was bright and cold. My car was the only one in the lot. I drove home. I did not go back the next night, or the night after. I did not call the supervisor line. I did not return the access code or the pen. I simply stopped going. I waited for a phone call, an email, some form of follow-up. None came. The staffing board no longer showed the listing. The email address I had originally applied to bounced back undeliverable. The phone number the woman had called me from connected to a generic voicemail with no identifying information. I left one message, and was not called back. 3 weeks passed. I got another job, a normal job, daytime, at a shipping company. I filed invoices. I talked to people. The world behaved the way it was supposed to. I began to sleep at night again, and for a while, I didn't dream about the room. Then, I noticed something. I was at my new job, at my new desk, in an open-plan office with 30 other people. I was filing an invoice. The date was a Thursday. I looked at the clock on my computer. It was 2:45 in the afternoon, and for one moment, less than a second, the office was empty. Not dark, not changed, just empty. Every desk was there, every computer, every chair, every stack of paper, but no people. The room was full of objects and devoid of presence. I blinked and everyone was back. My coworker was talking to me about a shipment. The phone was ringing. The room was full. I said something appropriate and went back to my invoice. That night, I sat in my apartment and opened the notebook. The small spiral-bound notebook I had used during my shifts. I turned to the last page I had written on. Below my final entry, in my handwriting, in black ink from the medium point pen, there was a line I had not written. Status: empty. I closed the notebook. I put it in a drawer. I have not opened it since. But I check. Every 15 minutes, wherever I am, whatever I'm doing, some part of my mind performs the observation. It looks at the room I'm in, whatever room that is, and it confirms. I don't write it down. I don't need to. The log continues. The check marks accumulate in a column I can't see, in a binder I don't have, in a building I can no longer find. The room is always empty. The room is always being watched. I am always watching it. I don't know when I became the camera. I don't know when the room became everywhere. I don't know when empty stopped being a description and became a function, something I perform, something I maintain, something that requires me in order to be true. The room is empty. I am confirming this. I will confirm it again in 15 minutes. I will confirm it for as long as I am here, in this room, in any room, in the room that is all rooms, the room that needs to be empty, the room that is empty because I say so, the room that I cannot stop watching because if I stop watching, the status becomes unknown, and an unknown status is the one thing the system cannot allow. I was hired to monitor a room that was supposed to stay empty. The room is empty. I'm in the room. The room is empty. These are not contradictions. These are the terms of my employment. I check the status. I confirm. I am still here. The room is still empty. I will check again soon.